Before President Emmanuel Macron takes the stage, we're joined again by Professor Philippe Le Corre. He's Professor of Geopolitics at ESSEC Business School and Senior Fellow on Foreign Policy. Professor Le Corre, very quickly, Mr. Macron will be meeting Mr. Hegseth, presumably, at least on the sidelines, if not actually face-to-face, in a formal meeting at the Shangri-La Dialogue. Given tough relations between the US and the EU under this new administration, how do you foresee relations in the days, months, weeks, years ahead?
Well, it is difficult, obviously, when you remember what Vice President J.D. Vance said to the Europeans at the counterpart of the IISS Shangri-La Dialogue in Europe, which is the Munich Security Conference. He said that the threat to Europe was within rather than outside, which, of course, all the Europeans disagreed with. So there is some tension, and obviously there are some ideological divergence there. And the fact that, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, of course, has not spent much time in Europe and has not interacted a lot with NATO allies is not a good sign for the sort of military cooperation between the two sides of the Atlantic. And also on Asia, of course, the Secretary of Defense has said that the US is committed to work with allies and partners in Asia. So does that include Europe, or is it mainly Asian countries he was referring to? And by the way, the quotation by Secretary of Defense Hegseth is not necessarily a quotation that the European leaders would go along with when he said that, deterring the aggression from communist China. I don't know if we would use such language in Europe, but I think, it's worth
pardon me for
having
cutting
a discussion.
So you are suggesting that Secretary Hegseth, US moves on China might not be shared in conjunction with the European Union. So, for example, sanctions, the EU might not join in. Targeting China, the EU might not join in as well. The EU and the US not working together as they have been known to do in many years past.
No, I think there would be some sanctions from the European side should there be an aggression on Taiwan, for example. I mean, the issue of Taiwan has been raised considerably more in Europe over the past couple of years than it was in the past. And the South China Sea has become also a serious issue addressed in European ministries of defense as well. So there would be some reaction. What I'm saying is the language that the Trump administration is using vis-a-vis China, vis-a-vis the region, which may be explaining why also the Chinese Minister of Defense is not there this year. Maybe could be different when you hear President Macron's speech in a few minutes, I guess. Having said that, there is a lot of concern in Europe about the tensions that are arising in Asia Pacific, from the Korean Peninsula to the South China Sea. And I think, what President Macron will be trying to say is that there's a third way, there's a different way, which is the European approach to tensions, which may be met more in the eyes of the ASEAN leaders, I'm suspecting. And hopefully the European approach will be more cooperative rather than confrontational between the West, or what remains of the West, and China.
All right. We're seeing pictures actually of Emmanuel Macron waiting to deliver his speech, but very quickly. So the difference between the EU and the US, would it just be in tone, the way they deliver their message, or would you think there will be real differences in the substance of their approach to China, to Russia, to North Korea, to Iran?
Well, it's a big question. There are many differences. First of all, because the interactions are different. There's the question of Ukraine, which is, of course, very important for the Europeans, which the US administration seems to be ignoring or trying to find ways to get out of this situation without really committing a long term on Ukraine. And of course, the Europeans will be maintaining a lot of pressure on the rest of the world to remain remain committed on Ukraine. Vis-à-vis Asia, I think the Europeans are interested in staying there, in remaining a player. But of course, in strategic means, the Europeans do not have the capabilities that the Americans have. I think the relationships that Macron and other European leaders are establishing or are maintaining with Asian leaders are very critical in this world of big power competition, and the fact there might be more tensions and crises emerging in Asia in the years to come. I'm thinking of the Taiwan Strait in particular, and the South China Sea, which again is of high concern, in Brussels and in Paris and Berlin. The situation in Europe has changed tremendously with the war in Ukraine, with European defense becoming more significant.
All right, we will be paying very close attention to what President Macron says about Ukraine in that speech, which he will be shortly delivering. But very quickly now, Asia looking to Europe. What can Europe offer Asia?
So Europe can offer a different approach to international relations than the sort of, I was referring to Secretary Hexet's remarks vis-à-vis communist China. I think, again, the Europeans are concerned. The relationship between the EU and China are not at the best now, but we are remaining open, for example, on certain issues, on climate, on global governance, on biodiversity. And there are signs of this when the dialogue between the US and China on these matters is not what it was under the previous administration. And using a confrontational tone as the secretary has just now is not going to help improving the dialogue, even though I'm, of course, conscious of the fact President Trump has been very polite with regard to his Chinese counterpart. And then, of course, it's very difficult.